It's no secret that the far right has seen a political resurgence of electoral victories in the past decade. It is also no secret that in the fascism of the far right lies an ideology that is responsible for the worst human rights abuses in modern history. We must therefore be keen and swift in identifying when such ideologies are present in order to counter them. Political theorists and sociologists have studied the origins of nationalism and authoritarianism for as long as the disciplines have existed. Yet there is a major resurgence in academic literature on fascism and nationalism in the 19th and 1940s in direct response to the horrors fascism exposed to the world during the Second World War. Today we're going to focus on first defining authoritarianism, then understanding how the state maintains power under such a system, and next critically examining the underlying philosophy of all nation-states, finally applying this to the current politics of Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni in Italy, as well as the Casa Pound movement there, and the upcoming elections in Argentina. Ultimately, though, these defining characteristics are all applicable to fascist movements around the globe, including in the United States. So without further ado, let's get started. Hannah Arendt was one of the first major scholars to talk about fascism. In 1951, she published her book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. In this book, she traces back the origins to anti-Semitism in Europe, mainly the statelessness of the Jews, as well as imperialism coming home, mostly from the French and English empires, which is a very similar argument to Lenin, and a crisis of loneliness, which she ties to her division of the private and public spheres in her other book, The Human Condition. She defined totalitarianism as different from authoritarianism. Totalitarianism was the use of state power against all people in the state, whereas authoritarianism was only the use of fear and state power against the enemies of the state. This established an idea of the state trying to keep people in line, both friends and enemies. Arendt established a working definition for totalitarianism, as well as a philosophical framework to institute formal human rights in response to what had happened. With this being said, Arendt didn't establish an exact definition for fascism, and nor was her definition of totalitarianism complete, as it didn't distinguish between immutable characteristics that are the targets of fascism, such as race and sexual orientation, and the sociological roles of class that was targeted by the Bolsheviks in theory, even though in practice the Bolsheviks similarly used anti-Semitism as a means of scapegoating. Looking critically at her own work, Arendt realized that philosophers can't just lock themselves in a room and study political philosophy while the theory happens in real life in the real world. She experienced this as she was living in Europe under fascism. So she decided that she would no longer define herself as a political philosopher, rather she would define herself as a political theorist.
Zu meiner ersten Frage kommen. Empfinden Sie Ihre Rolle im Kreise der Philosophen, trotz der Anerkennung und des Respekts, den man ihnen zollt, als eine Besonderheit? Oder berühren wir damit ein Emanzipationsproblem, das für Sie nie existiert hat?
Ja, ich fürchte, ich muss erst einmal protestieren. Ich gehöre nicht in den Kreis der Philosophen. Mein Beruf, wenn man davon überhaupt sprechen kann, ist politische Theorie. Ich fühle mich keineswegs als Philosophen. Ich bin auch nicht, ich glaube nicht, in den Kreis der Philosophen aufgenommen, wie Sie freundlicherweise meinen.
Discussing how the state maintains power under fascism. One of the major scholars in this area is Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci was famous for writing the prison notebooks while imprisoned by Mussolini for his socialist work. Gramsci rejected orthodox Marxism, instead of viewing the economic system of capitalism as the superstructure through which everything else follows. His theory of cultural hegemony suggested a relationship between the capitalist influence on the economy and the capitalist control of the culture, reinforcing the status quo both of the state and capitalist class. This will further our understanding of fascism in both Italy and Argentina, as hegemony explains the way in which the state maintains power under fascism. It isn't simply that the fascist state is backed by the capitalists with power, as many Marxists at the time argued, including Marx himself. Rather, the state, in congruence with many capitalists, reinforced the legitimacy of the state through the culture. This is what his idea of hegemony truly meant. A strong state, under Gramsci, doesn't have police on every corner defending it, nor does it have a massive military keeping everyone in line. Rather, in a strong state, citizens buy into the premise of the propaganda and the national creation myth, naturally reinforcing its power, which is ultimately what was happening in Italy under Mussolini and what has happened in all far-right movements, especially in Argentina. Argentina experienced what's called Peronism. Yes, there was also Videla and the military junta that attacked many citizens and had many human rights abuses. But under Peronism, it was a combination of strong labor and left-wing social policy in terms of economics, with right-wing conservatism in both Argentina and Italy. The state uses its hegemony in order to reinforce the national creation myth. In Italy, this meant going back to the days of the Roman Empire and the riorganizamiento, under which Italy was supposedly thriving. In Argentina, which is a settler colonial state similar to the United States, this means imagery of the frontier and conquering other peoples. Originally attack labor unions as Mussolini and most other fascists do. There is still a certain Eurocentrism intrinsic to his rhetoric. This can be seen in many ways, such as many people in Buenos Aires continuously referring to themselves as porteños. Porteño means someone of the port, and they like to define themselves in a European way as opposed to solely a Latin American identity. This can also be seen in this clip here.
Volver al país. Es tan complicado, vivimos tan lejos de todo, ¿no? Yo veo de allá qué fácil es esos muchachos que tienen unas vacaciones, pues se toman un tren y se van a Venecia, o se van a Viena, o se van a Madrid, o de París, pero donde sea. Tan cerca, todo tan fácil. Acá vivimos tan lejos, ¿no? Y estamos tan a contramano, ¿no?
As you can see, they define themselves in the European identity through this hegemony of the ruling class. Peronist parties exist today in Argentina as well, although these parties are very different than Perón's original party, and it's not fair to say that they're exactly the same breed of fascism and nationalism, or even if they are fascist. Now let's look at how this has developed in Italy.
Moi, je crois que Mussolini, c'était un bon politicien. C'est-à-dire que tout ce qu'il a fait pour l'Italie.
That was Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni praising Mussolini. This is also similar in the Casa Pound movement happening around Italy, which is a resurgence of fascism with a new metropolitan turn. Through Casa Pound's rhetoric, as well as Meloni's and the intrinsic rhetoric of certain Peronist parties in Argentina, we can see how fascism creates an in-group and excludes an out-group. This is the main idea of fascism, and it uses Gramsci's hegemony to then maintain control under Arendt's totalitarian framework. Obviously, this is very incomplete, as this is the nature of my research. I've only done a literature review this summer. I'm planning on finishing this research the next few summers. Needless to say, though, these are ways in which we can identify these movements in order to stop them, because they will cause harm if we let them take power. Yet there are actionable things that we can do to fight against them. I'd also like to emphasize that this is not something that's intrinsic to Argentina or Italy or Germany with the Nazis or anywhere. Nationalism and fascism happen in every state in every part of the world and have and continue to happen this way. We need to be aware of this in order to not essentialize or exoticize it, but rather recognize when it happens in our home soil too in order to stop it, with no actual solutions. But that's just the nature of this research for the summer. There are real solutions, and I could get into a lot of them, but I don't want to do that without having researched them first. Ultimately, there is so much more written on fascism than was touched on in this video, yet for the sake of time, the focus was on Arendt and Gramsci, and that was necessary. We in academia must be aware of the role we can play in identifying or perpetuating these ideologies. And as stated previously, this is still incomplete as I'm only just beginning this summer, so I know that this video seemed to jump around a lot, and that was intentional because of the nature of my research this summer. In order to see the full solutions, we'll have to keep researching.